You're listening to the world's smartest podcast network.
Welcome back to another episode of Majoring in Everything. I am your host, Andrea Jones-Rooy. We are joined once again by someone else who majors in everything. Today, we're very excited to welcome to the show someone I only recently met, but the moment I met him, I was like, he's one of us. Welcome to the show, Chris Duffy.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. Hello, I'm one of you.
You're one of us. I hope that's okay. I've already made some assumptions about you. You're like, I don't want to be in this club. Jesus
Always
Christ.
glad to be included in any club.
There we go. So we met mere weeks before the time of this recording, and we did Kasha Patel's DC Science comedy show together, and I saw you perform. You were amazing, and it so happens. So I learned all the things about, well, not all the things, but I learned that you're a comedian, a former science teacher, radio host. We talked about how, we all have credits on NPR, but you have years of credits of NPR, whereas I've been on it one time. But the audience doesn't have to know that. And about 10 million other things in between. Have I accurately summarized the sorts of things that you're up to?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you so much for those very kind words. And yeah, the only thing is different is I actually taught all subjects in fifth grade. So I wasn't just a science teacher.
Oh, right. Of course. In fifth grade,
it was like
they don't
that's the school I taught at.
Yeah.
At least at the school I taught at, it was the last year where you taught everything in one classroom.
Right. Why did I think science teacher? Maybe because it was just science comedy night. And I was
Could be.
Science.
Yeah, it's ironically actually the one subject that I did not teach when I was teaching was science, but I have done science communication stuff before. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so tell all of us today what are the big things that you're working on today? Like, how would you characterize your career
at this current moment in time? Yeah. I think at this current moment, the big things that I do are I host a podcast for TED where I interview people who have given TED Talks and try and make their work accessible to regular people and just think like, okay, and the show's called How to Be a Better Human. So it's basically like, okay, you're this incredible, impressive person who's given this talk that's everyone watches, but how would like a regular person put that into practice in their lives? And trying to make it accessible and fun. So that's one of the big things. And that's what probably many people would know me from. I'm also a TV writer and a comedian. And yeah, and then I also do all sorts of other like live and digital live, like streaming live events for the National Academy of Sciences sometimes.
Oh, very cool. In what capacity do you like produce them or run the tech?
I host a show for them every month that is where comedians interview scientists about their work.
Oh, right. What is that called?
It's called Wrong Answers Only.
Yes. Okay. Very cool. So so you were not a science teacher, you were a teacher of fifth grade. Yes. How did you end up in this world where you're doing comedy and, often just straight up comedy, but also using your skills as a comedian, performer, writer to talk to technical people, right? So if you're interviewing scientists, you're talking to these experts on TED or from TED Talks, like how did you get to that niche for yourself?
Yeah. Well, I think the shortest answer is that like, I have no idea. It involved a lot of luck and it was very random.
Fabulous.
And I can give you the actual path because I do think it's maybe interesting to people, especially if you're interested in majoring and everything. It is a little bit of that. But yeah, I'll start at the beginning if you want.
Please.
Let's
go.
Me to give you the whole spiel? Yeah. So I think that while I similarly think that you are absolutely hilarious and loved like watching you do it, and I feel like we are in similar worlds, I actually think that maybe we come at it from very different ways because you like actually are a scientist and do actual research, and I am very much not a scientist and I majored in English, and I'm like I think that probably the things that have worked in my career have come from me being like I'm interested in but not knowledgeable about this stuff. And so I think that probably the skill that ties all the things together in retrospect is me being like, I really want to understand. And if you can explain it to me, probably other people will understand it as well, because I don't have a technical background.
Well, it sounds like you have the gifts of humility and curiosity. We can put it that way on your resume, right?
Curiosity, yes. Humility, yeah, guys, we have clearly not spent enough time together.
Okay, great.
Huge head, absolutely giant inflated ego. Well, all this started because I have always really been interested in making people laugh, and I have always been interested in like education and journalism. So in college, I went to Brown. I studied creative nonfiction writing, which at the time was like, what are you going to do with that? And now, ironically, is like literally what I do every single day.
I'm not sure I feel like I can piece it together, but what is creative nonfiction writing?
It's basically the same thing as like creative writing, where you're trying to make a story that entertains people, but you're using real facts instead of creating the characters.
Okay.
So like, a classic example of creative nonfiction would be like a profile in the New Yorker. That's like a creative nonfiction piece. Or, if you read like an essay by someone who is talking about, I'm trying to think of like ones, a lot of the famous essays in creative nonfiction are ones where there's a little too much fiction in them. So I was going to be like Hunter S. Thompson, but it's like, yeah, there's some
not
fiction
quite
in
right.
there.
Yeah.
But, a lot of comedy is creative nonfiction.
Okay.
So anyway, I basically, in college, I thought I was going to be a journalist. I was basically like working at the newspaper. That's what I wanted to do. I applied to really every single paper in the country that I could possibly find. And I was applying at a time, which not like there's ever been a good time for journalism in the last 15 years, but I was applying it in like one of the years where an enormous amount of papers closed. And so I actually got a lot of messages back that were like, this newspaper no longer exists. Like, unfortunately, we're not hiring anyone. We fired everyone in staff, which is not what you want when you're like, I'm trying to build a career in this. And ultimately, I basically like had one very nice conversation with someone who was like, hey, I read your clips. I'm so glad you applied. Like, you obviously are talented, which was really nice to hear. And he was like, I've never had this happen before, but someone with a Pulitzer Prize applied for this entry-level job. So I just want to let you know, like, I don't want you to be discouraged, but like, we have to take that person.
Right.
And that was kind of a sign to me where I was like, okay, so this is probably not going to work out for me.
Wow.
And
those are aggressive rejection, like not personal rejections, but it's not like, you made it, it's just like, you're either up against a Pulitzer Prize or the paper is closed. You're just like, that's a cliff that you're facing. It's not about you personally. It's just like that. Yeah.
I know. Rough. And I kind of felt like in some ways that was like more disheartening to be like, oh, it's not even that I need to make my application better or get better. It's that like the literal industry is collapsing around me. So then I started to think like, what could I do where I could like still fulfill that goal, which is like to write and to communicate in that way. And I was also, please stop me if this is like too long.
No.
Okay.
No. Go.
I started to think like, what can I do to kind of like scratch that itch? And I'd always also really liked teaching. So I was like, oh, well, maybe if I do something where like I get to be somewhere where there aren't that many reporters, I could like file stories from a place where there's not that many other people. So I just started then applying to like international things. And I hadn't really traveled very much before. I didn't have like a lot of experience. I hadn't really like had the like money to travel. And so the idea of like getting a job that would like pay for me to be somewhere else also was appealing. So I applied to like a State Department language grant where they were like, we'll pay for you to spend a few months in a country learning a language that we need more Americans to speak. And I also applied to a ton of teaching abroad jobs. And I ended up getting, through totally coincidentally, a State Department grant to learn English in South Korea, to learn Korean in South Korea.
I was like, your English is incredible. Well done.
I know. I really got good at it.
Yeah. In South Korea, the home of great English.
Exactly. And so I went there and was living outside of Seoul and taking classes at a university. And I would try and like pitch stories internationally from there. And that actually had some success in like getting stories published.
So were you pitching to places in the US and you're like, hey, I'm at this, I'm stationed in South Korea. Here's some cool. Okay.
Totally. So like I did a story that was like about how there were dissidents, North Korean dissidents who lived in South Korea, who one of the ways they were trying to communicate with North Korea was to inflate giant weather balloons and then attach like literature and care packages to the weather balloon. So they were like float the balloons across the border.
Wow.
And it's just kind of like a strange thing, but it was actually pretty successful in getting stuff to regular people, so much so that like the North Korean government had put out official statements of like, you must stop the balloon launches.
Wow.
And that was like the kind of story where I was like, wow, what a cool thing to get to like express and look at these geopolitical issues through a kind of unusual lens.
Yeah.
But then it was still one of those where I was like, this isn't really it was just fun and I like it, but it was very clear to me that like I wasn't ever going to be able to string enough like North Korean balloon stories together to pay my bills. So I was like, okay, well, I like teaching and maybe teaching will be the thing. And so I taught English. I taught it in Athens, Greece for a year and did some more writing there. And then while I was in Greece, the economy collapsed so much so that like with my last paycheck, they were like, why don't you take that money out of the bank and keep it under your mattress? Because the banks may stop letting you take money out. And I was like, okay, once again, clear sign. This is perhaps not. One thing that I can guarantee you is if I try and get into your industry, the entire industry will collapse.
I'm picturing you as like what's that game, Tomb Rush or something, where you're
where
exactly you're running and the ground is falling underneath you. Like that's what I'm picturing as you're like, I'm going to do journalism. I'm going to live in Greece.
Yeah. Well, that's a very generous view of it. I like the view of it's crumbling behind me and not I'm causing it. So that's great. Yeah. Not like I get to somewhere and they're like, we better pull out of this economy. Chris is here.
Yeah. It's over. Yeah. Like Greece, we had a good run. Like,
only 4,000, 6,000 years. Great. Yeah. And then Chris got here and time to shut it down.
Yeah.
But yeah, I had a great, I really loved being there and felt like I met some great people. Anyway, it was kind of had these adventures and then I was like, okay, well, what am I going to do? And so I got a job teaching fifth grade at a school in Boston, public school. And it was great. I worked there. I really loved it. And on the side, I was just doing comedy as a way to like blow off steam. And, there started to be a little piece of me that was like, I don't have any free time and I don't sleep enough. And I still will like go to this terrible improv theater. I mean, not terrible, but like I'll go to this little improv theater and do a show that's like for 10 people. Like there's something that's clearly driven in me to do that. But again, it still didn't seem like a career.
And you were doing improv as opposed to like stand up at that time or both?
I started in improv and then I kind of like moved to stand up. Kind of once it started to be a little bit more like I had some success, then I started to be a little bit more. And by success, I just mean like I was able to perform more and like people were kind of coming to my shows, even a few people. Then I was like, I started to think it would be good if when I invited people, I could predict that the show was going to be good.
Yes. So I started in improv as well. And that was one of the big things is I was like, generally our team, like we can pull it off. It's not gonna be the best improv you've ever seen, but it's decent. But every now and again, you're just like, I don't know, man, it could be horrible. And unlike you, I switched to stand up. I was okay at improv, but I switched to stand up because I was just like, I'm not good enough. I mean, I always wanted to do stand up, but I didn't switch because I got better at improv. I was like, I need to stand still in front of a microphone. Someone was like, what characters do you normally do? And I was like, I've literally never done anyone but like myself. So
that's so funny. Yeah. Well, that's a great sign to me as your staff. Yeah. I mean, I really like them both. I think that I still do both. And I think that like improv is more fun for me to do and stand up is more fun for the audience to see. That's how I feel about my performances. And it wasn't even like, it's just like sometimes with improv, it'll be like the funniest thing that I've ever done. And other times it'll be like, well, I wouldn't have chosen those topics for this to be a show if you told me that my mom and in-laws were going to be here. I would not have gone down these roads. And I like being able to have some control. I think that is also a marker of many stand-up comedians is the desire to be like, I have control over your reactions and also what you see. Yep.
This is only making me think of one of the last times I did improv in front of my family. They came up to New York City and it was like a UCB class show, forever ago. And they're like, we need a suggestion from the audience. And my dad said innuendo. And that could be like a spy thing or like a subtle word
I know exactly where that show's going. I've seen that show about 1,000 times.
Exactly. And it was just scene after scene of these people in my, like, it wasn't even a team that I liked my classmates and they were talented, but it wasn't like a team that I trusted. And and it was just scene after scene of lecherous man hitting on a student, neighbor hitting on and I was like, this is horrible.
One of my favorite things I know we're going off on a little tangent here, but one of my absolute favorite things that I feel like people don't do enough in improv and is great and always makes me laugh. And I'm like, that's the mark of someone who's done it for long enough is when they get a suggestion like that. And then they just say, my dad just suggested innuendo. I reject that suggestion.
Yeah.
We will get something else. I feel like often people think it's like such hallowed, like you have to do it. And I love when they're like, absolutely not. I've seen where this goes. I refuse to go down this road again.
Right.
And
it's like,
you have to go down it once to be like, yep, that's not going to happen twice.
And in that moment, I was like, this doesn't have to go dirty. And it was like, it's a UCB 301 class show at the East Village. Like it's going to go dirty.
Yep. I mean, you could have literally gotten any suggestion. I probably would have gone that same route. So, so yes, I was performing my lecherous man characters. and they were, that was fun. And I met some really great people who are still friends to this day. And then basically one time I kind of started getting to this place where I was like, people are coming to see me and that's really cool. But what am I talking about? I had this like thing in the back of my head where I was like, like I feel some sort of vague responsibility that like, if I'm going to be on stage, I should be talking about something that matters. And I don't quite know what is my thing that matters personally. And I was living in, I was teaching in Boston. So I was living in Cambridge and I was constantly taking the bus between, and I would pass Harvard, I would pass MIT. And I just thought like, wow, like there are people on this bus who are doing things that will legitimately change the world. And I don't know what they do. And no one on this bus knows what they do. And there's never a way that I'll get to talk to them. So that was the seed of the idea that I had for what if I did a show where comedians and scientists came together. And I did I applied for like a local arts grant. I mean, like super small. I think it was like literally $150, something like that. But at the time it was like, if I get this grant, then I can rent the small room at the movie theater, which was like, I think it was $20 to rent for an hour or something like that. And basically like it just covered the cost to do this first show. And the show went really well. People really liked it. It was like comedians trying to guess what this person did. And then we talked to them about why their work mattered. And over the years that idea got refined, but it basically was always that same core of like, we're trying to figure out what you do and we're not going to make fun of you. We're going to be like, this is incredible. And we're the fools. Right. And so I recorded it. What I used that grant to do is I had my friend Kevin, who was a tech guy. I had him record it and we put it out as a podcast. And this was at the time when, it feels like this must have been so long ago, but it actually was very recently that podcasts were not a thing that people like respected or even understood. Yeah. And I think I just got lucky in that like I was putting something out at a time where there were not that many options. And so it got a fair amount of like a following just because there weren't other things like it at all.
And what was the podcast called at the time?
It was called You're the Expert.
You're the Expert. Yes, of course. Yeah. Okay, great.
And I basically took that, and this was while I was still teaching. But I took that and I sent a cold email to the two public radio stations in Boston. And I said, I'm making the show. It feels very public radio. It's scientists and comedians. It's clean, but it's also like funny and informative. Like, could I talk to you about it? And basically like I got like the lowest level person on both totem poles to say like, sure, like I'll let you buy me a coffee. And so I talked to one station. They were like, okay, like we're kind of interested in maybe doing this, but we have zero budget. And then I met with the other station and she basically was like, at the end of our conversation, she was like, this sounds like such a great idea. And I was like, oh, it's not an idea. It exists. Like you can come see it. We're going to do a live show next week. And that really caught her attention. She was like, wait, what? It already happens. That's new. That doesn't happen when people pitch us shows. And then I told her that the other public radio station was also interested in it. And then like she got a little competitive. So then she was like, hold on, do you have time? Could you stay for another half an hour? So then I met with her boss. And then her boss was kind of sold and also was like, wait, it exists. Also like, they're interested. Hold on. And basically at the end of this afternoon, I met with the head of the station.
This is a masterclass in negotiation and pitching, by the way, which I didn't expect. And I appreciate because I'm bad
I will say definitely it was me pitching well, but not negotiating at all.
Okay.
There was it was just like, I got lucky in that I was like, oh, well, like, yeah, like I'm glad you're into it. Like WGBH also is into it. And they were like, well, WBUR has to get something before WGBH gets it. And then I just got, again, I really think that like I don't think I'm being falsely humble. I think people often misrepresent the role of luck and how much luck is involved. I think I got super lucky in that I just hit this at the exact time where the thing that the head of the station said to me when he was like, great, well, like, let's do something together, is he was like, this has never happened before. Someone has never come in here with a show that already exists. That's new. And like, we want to get into podcasts, and the fact that you just make it and we wouldn't even have to, like, all you're asking for is like some support. That seems easy. And like, that's never happened before. And like, that happens every single day now, right? Like every day they're getting emails with like,
right.
I have a podcast. Will you put my podcast on air? So it was luck. And then it did.
You were ahead of your time as well, but yeah.
And so then anyway, that like started this process where they started giving me like a very small amount of money, but like in amount of money that was to me, like, wow, this is like an endorsement of my idea. And they were also working with me on it. And I got, again, one way I got so lucky is the producer who I'd had that like initial meeting with, who was low down on the totem pole at that time, quickly rose through the ranks. And her name was Lisa Tobin. And she ended up going on to create the Daily at the New York Times. So she like,
heard of that. Yeah,
I got super lucky in like having this person who is a genius at audio and like one of the all-time great audio producers was just like, I caught her on the upswing in her career. And so we were both like, hey, we're doing something interesting. And then she was on this rocket ship where eventually I was like, wow, see you later. And she's on the moon. Anyway, so I ended up, I really liked teaching. I think this was a big difference than many people. So I went to the principal and was like, hey, like, it just seems like this stuff might maybe work. And I feel like I know where I'm going to be in 40 years if I teach, and I know that I would like it. But the thing that I think will keep me from being happy is regretting, like, could I have done this? And to her credit, my principal was like, look, we hire people every year. If you want to like go and try this, like, we support you, we believe in you. And like, if it doesn't work out, like, come back. We'd love to have you back.
That's great. Not every employer has that view. So that's great.
No, and there was no reason why she had to be that kind of generous, but that really took the pressure off me financially, because I was like, all that I'm trying to do is survive for a year. And I did the math and I was like, I live with 3 roommates. I don't spend that much money. Like I did the math and I was like, between what I make right now in this like part-time weird thing, and if I got a job at Starbucks for a few hours a week, which I don't think would like eat into my creative time. But I was like, if I do those 2 things, I'll be able to pay the rent and I'll be able to pay my bills. And so I did that a year, and basically like the show kept growing. It started to like, I got paired up with a producer who was like very experienced in live events. And she and I started touring the show around colleges and around the country. We started going to like science festivals and comedy festivals. So more money was coming in, but I also started like meeting way more comedians. And at this time I was also like, I was in the middle of beginning stand-up. So now I was like, had an act. I had a platform, because we were paying people, which was always really important to me from the very beginning. Better and better comedians started coming on the show. And anyway, the show started doing well and got more of a listenership. And then one of the people who I'd met through the show, who'd been on the panel a bunch of times, was Josh Gondelman, who is hilarious and is a really good friend. And Josh had gotten hired at Last Week Tonight since I'd known him before, and then he got hired. And when that show came out and was really successful, people started reaching out to them about staffing other things. And so someone once emailed, I guess, the whole staff, and Josh had gotten it and was like, there's these people who are starting a show that's going to be science and comedy. It's like a late night show with science. Do you know anyone who'd be good for that? And Josh was like, oh, if you're looking for someone who does that, like, Chris is the only person who is doing this right now.
Yeah.
Like, you can listen to 100 episodes of his podcast. And I had never written for TV before. And I went in for this. I sent in my packet. I was very, again, this is luck. And also like, I had a skewed perception because it was the first packet I ever sent in, and I got an interview, and then I got the job. And now I've sent in like 5,000 packets.
Yeah.
And now I understand that like of the 5 jobs I've gotten, it's like 1 in 1,000. And this one, I just happened to be like, the first one was one of one. It
like landed on red, for green or whatever, the one that's hard to get. Yes. Yeah.
So I ended up writing for this, writing for both seasons of this show on National Geographic. That was like, it was called Explorer, which is like their flagship program, but they were trying to turn it into like more of like a late night hosted show that would have like a monologue and then would go into like small, shorter documentary segments. And so it lasted for 2 seasons and had a bunch of like rotating celebrity hosts. So like got to work with Jeff Goldblum. I got to work with Ted Danson, with all sorts of amazing people. And then when that ended, one of the people, I'd made a lot of friends from that, and it had been a really good experience in terms of like who I'd met. And so one of the producers then recommended me to work to send in a packet to Wyatt Cenac's Problem Areas, his HBO show that he was starting. And Wyatt had been on You're the Expert many times, so I already knew him. So
is that how you knew Josh as well? Was he on You're the Expert? Okay, great.
And then, so like, it basically started to be like, I had met a lot of people through doing the show where they'd been on the panel. And it's always great when you meet people. Like, one of the pieces of advice I always give people who are trying to break into comedy is like, start a show. It doesn't have to be like a big theme show. It could just be like a weekly stand-up show. But like, when you meet someone because you're like, come be on my show, especially if you're like, come be on my show, it's paid and we treat you well. Yep. But even if it's just, let me give you time at a show that there's a good audience, people like you because it's just, that's rare. People often treat comedians terribly.
Right.
So if you treat people well, like, my rule for myself is forever, I always, if it's at all possible, I make sure that people are paid. And no matter what, I send people a thank you email afterwards. And that alone puts you in like the top 10% of people who treat comedians, which is so sad. But like, as a result, you know, people were like, I think people had a positive feeling about me as a person.
Right.
And that wasn't just why I was doing it. I was doing it because I feel like that's the right thing to do. But
right. It wasn't all business scheming. It was like, no, I'm a decent human, so I'm going to say thank you and give you some money.
Totally. And then that also ended up with like me becoming like genuine friends with many of these people. And then the more that you're friends with them, then like you meet other people through them. And at this point also, like, I was doing better in stand-up. And so like I had a stand-up show that was not at all science comedy.
Right.
And
like a regular stand-up show.
Yeah. And I was just like I had all sorts of stuff going on in comedy. And I was, you know, like I went and did SF Sketchfest. I like was performing in places where like I would meet other comedians as peers. And so Wyatt and I knew each other mostly through You're the Expert, but I had like been on a few other shows with him. So we were, how do I put it? I would definitely not say we were friends, but we were friendly. Okay. And like we were at the level where I wouldn't have known how to contact him through a phone or an email, but I would have, if we ran into each other on the street, been like, hello, Wyatt, and not felt like I was harassing a famous person.
Right.
So for that show, they read packets blind, and I guessed that I like wrote a packet that was good enough, and I got to the second round. And then when I went into the second round, which is the interview, which if people are listening and you don't really know how TV writing jobs work, for late night shows, basically they put out a call, which is called a packet. And they're like, write these 3 things that are representative of the kind of things you'd write on the show. And you submit those, and then they read, you know, hundreds of those, and they pick the ones that they think are funny. And then the second round is typically an interview with the people, like the head writer and the host of the show. And that second round is typically less about whether you're funny. The first round is funny. And the second round is, would I want to be in a room with you for 10 hours? Like, are you going to be like a jerk? So like, it's kind of like a
nice person who I can work with.
Yeah. Like what's your vibe when like I critique your ideas, or like, how do you work and your style, like all of that stuff.
Yeah.
So obviously it was a lot easier having already known, like, I've been in a room for 5 hours. We can guess what the other 5 would be.
Right.
And so I got hired on that, and it was like an amazing experience. I felt like we were making stuff that really mattered. The first season was all about policing in America. It was coming at it through the lens of solutions journalism. So looking at like 10 different solutions to like, how can we solve policing in America? The second season was about education. Same thing. Got to work with like in this writer's room, which is like absolutely hilarious, unbelievable people who are so funny and great. You know, kind of that good feeling of you're like, wait, how did I get into this room? I think.
Yeah.
But also like just laughing all day, every day.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, it was a great experience. The show ended after 2 seasons.
When did it end? Because it's a recent-ish show, right? I remember it being on.
Yeah. So let's see. I think that it ended. It was either 2018 or 2019. I can't remember exactly when. But and you know, I think unfortunately it was a little before its time. I've thought many times that I think if it stayed on the air for like 2 more years, it would be on the air forever. I think Wyatt is just like, he's a really unique voice, and it's a shame that like when this huge national conversation about policing happened, Wyatt wasn't still on the air, because he had already done such nuanced work in a way that I just think no one else did. I think that is kind of like I I don't feel it as a personal tragedy for me, but I feel it as a tragedy for him because I know how. I just think he would have gone from like, I make this show that people like and respect and is critically acclaimed, but is a niche show to, I think that would have been the thing that potentially could have like been a real driver in a national conversation.
Right. Like this show can crystallize the things that we're talking about in this national conversation that's currently just people yelling at each other on Twitter.
It's wild that he was like we made a show where one of the episodes was about like police abolition. And it was at a time where they were like, this is the craziest idea that no one's even heard of. And then 3 years later, that was like a real national topic. And like Wyatt I know that if he had had that platform, then people would have paid attention in a different way.
I feel like I even read an article in 2020, midway through 2020, that was like, by the way, there's a show that already exists.
Yes.
Like Wyatt Cenac season 1 problem areas.
Totally.
Like, I mean, education is obviously also a huge part of the national campaign, but the urgency around policing in particular. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I just think, anyway, I have a lot of respect for him as like an artist and his like integrity around that stuff. Not just the topic, but just in general. Like he made things that I think really like centered communities and did things in a different way. And it was like, it wasn't the answer was like, I'm going to like parachute in. It was like, okay, what are people doing on the ground in a place that doesn't often get attention? Right. So anyway, it was a great experience. That show ended for a variety of reasons, mostly life, actually, not career. I moved to Los Angeles, and then the pandemic happened, and so I worked remotely.
You got out just in time. Not that LA had it easy, but you could.
No, but it was a much better place to be. I mean, like just outside. The fact that all of the criticisms that people have of LA are like they're what was prescribed for the pandemic. They're like, LA is a socially distanced place where you're often isolated. Yeah, and I was like, oh, perfect. Well, good to be here now.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then basically, like I was here. I worked on a couple of different like shorter term shows, and then someone from TED had seen me do stand up and had liked my stand-up set right before the pandemic. So I auditioned and got the job to host this podcast for them. And then I did that. And so, I really have gone on a long time about this whole career thing, but basically everything that I do, I think of as like, on one end is like straight comedy. And on the other end is like straight journalism and education. And ideally I'm somewhere in the middle. So that's one of the things that was great about Wyatt Show. And that's one of the things that's really fun about the podcast now. And and I try and like, whenever I feel like I'm a little too heavy on one side, I try and add some things on the other.
Well, so that was what I wanted. And thank you for sharing all of that. And I wanted to ask, have you found pressure, either self-imposed or from the worlds that you're in, to zoom in on one versus the other? So, if you're doing TED or you're working public radio and you're getting a lot of positive feedback on that front, are you like, comedy helped me get here and I'm going to zoom in here? And the same with comedy, I imagine, at least, most comedians do comedy full time who want to be full time. I mean, it's sort of like an all or nothing career. Do you get that pressure, or did you put that on yourself at any point? Or were you like, I like being in both and that's okay?
Oh, I definitely get that pressure and I feel it. I think it's something I struggle with, to be honest. I think so much of the work of this career and also just of life in general is like figuring out like who you are.
Yeah.
And I definitely struggle with the like who I am versus like how I want to be perceived, because like it's so much cooler to just be a comedian, right? Like when you're like, I'm a stand-up, people are like, wow, I could never do that. And then when you're like, I do science stuff, they're like, who else is in this room? It's not like,
in a way that even stand-up compared to improv, which is, they're both very hard. I'm way worse at improv. I have a ton of respect for people who are great at improv. I would tell people that and they'd be like, I don't care. But you say stand-up and everyone's just like, and
I think that like I genuinely really love doing stand-up, and I love the process of coming up with jokes and finding that. I think that it is, I think that increasingly the way that I answer the question of like that pressure is I try and separate out like what I do for money, what I do for my own creative fulfillment, and what I do because like it lets me collaborate with great people. And sometimes it's all three, but like I try and be clear now about like, okay, sometimes I'm going to do things that aren't like exactly my 100% creative voice because it like pays the bills, and there's nothing wrong with that. And sometimes I'm going to do things that are like probably never going to make money just because it's like really fulfilling.
Right. And I think getting to a point where first of all, having the financial and life stability to be able to do things that are fulfilling because you have money coming in from somewhere else, like is a tough place to get to.
Totally.
But then getting there and then also being able to give yourself that permission is impressive, because I see a lot of people, and maybe this is a little bit outdated now, but it's like every hobby you have is a side hustle. And if you're not getting money, why are you doing it? And I think we're moving away from that. And I've seen a movement away from that since kind of heavy pandemic days. Yeah. But even I do it. I'm like, why am I messing around over here? And it's like, oh, because it keeps me sane and it's fun. And maybe that's okay. And it's not zero sum in the way that I've feared it is.
Oh, I think that's so well said. Yeah. And I think also like, this is not normal. This is not like reasonable, like,
yeah.
My dad worked for 30 years for the Port Authority. Like he had a job that was like, it wasn't like sexy or like particularly fun. It was just like a job where he was like, yes, it's a paycheck. And I care about like the work that I'm doing, but it's not like, I'm not like passionate about drug testing the toll workers,
right.
That's just the thing. And I think I often try and compare my stuff to like when I was teaching, where I'm like, that is a crucial, valuable public service. It's wild to think that I can make any money being a comedian. So the fact that it's now been more than a decade where this has been my job, I honestly, at the end of every year, I'm like, I can't believe it worked again. Like that's really how I think about it, is like, somehow it's working. All right, well, another year I snuck it by them.
Do you, when you think about where you want to go forward, do you see yourself really living kind of the 50-50 comedy journalism lives? I mean, obviously a lot of what you're doing is in both, but do you tend towards one or the other? You're like, I definitely would love to do like more on comedy or more on journalism, say, in the next 12 months.
Well, I think one thing that I try and do is just like be open to like the path opening before me and being like, hey, this is working. Okay, like let's follow that. That's exciting. I always want to be like learning and developing new skills. But yeah, I mean, I think that like one of the things that that has gotten me more and more excited over the past couple years has been the idea of like working with people who I really admire and love. And so the dream for me would be to be in a situation where I sold a TV show or some sort of product where then I'd get to like hire a room full of people. I would like absolutely love that. That is like really where I want to be. I think that the skill of being a showrunner is something that I'm like really excited about trying to pursue. And the way I think about it these days is like, I'm lucky enough that I have these other projects that I like doing that kind of pay the bills. And that not in like they only pay the bills, but just like they pay the bills and I have some other time. And so with my spare time, I really think about it as like, I'm doing things that are creatively fulfilling and that are also like buying lottery tickets. And maybe a pilot that I write, I'll actually sell and then I'll get to like staff a show. But it's okay if it's a lottery ticket. It would just like, that's the dream.
Very cool. So, and I think this reminds me of a theme that you pointed out early on, and I'm glad that you mentioned it, because a lot of times we do discount this, is that like, there's a lot of luck and there's a lot of dice rolling, and not to minimize, you don't just randomly get jobs. You get a job because you're talented, but you have to you have to send 5,000 packets and you have to show up and do 6,000 videos, 5,990 that go nowhere. And totally. I think when I talk to a lot of my students and they look at people's careers, and you look at someone's list on LinkedIn, your favorite website, right? And wherever else we might like put our bios or whatever on social media, it all looks much more on purpose than it is.
Totally. Yeah. And, I mean, it's funny because, not to like call this one specific person out, but just as an example of it, is people get so upset when you like some people get so upset when you talk about like privilege and stuff like that and luck. But it always is funny to me when you see like celebrity children who become actors, right? When Colin Hanks is like, sure, my dad got me the audition, but I still had to do the part. And like, I still had to like get the part. And I'm not trying to minimize that he had to be good in the audition, but anyone who has ever tried to act knows that like getting the audition is the hard part. Like getting to like be good in the audition, that is not the hard part. Is like months of being like, no one is calling me back. Right. I am worthless. Why am I here? So whenever people say like, well, I still had to do the thing, I'm like, yeah, okay. But you kind of got a pretty big leg up by just being in the room in the first place.
Well, and I
don't even know. Maybe Colin Hanks has never said that, but he is representative of a person who I can conceive of as having said something.
I will say that the fan base for Majoring and Everything and the fan base for Colin Hanks are basically the same group. So
I know. I'm so sorry,
really
Colin. I know you listen to every episode.
Here.
Yes,
but
Colin, you have. I really do actually think you've built a career for yourself, and I admire the choices you've made. So it's more your other brother Chet or something else.
Right. Yeah, and I think his decision not to change his name from Hanks was actually very brave.
Yes.
Because
so brave. Honestly, one of the most courageous things that's happened.
The headwinds of the expectations must have really been difficult. No, I mean, and I'm gonna get in my own Colin Hanks hot water because I think a lot of that is true in academia as well. And I'm on the admissions committee for master's program here at NYU, and I've been on admissions committees for PhD programs, and I have a sense of how undergrad admissions work, and it's free for all, and a lot of it's random. There's a lot. I mean, we see the stories and everything about parents bribing their way in and various scholarships and nefarious legacy, whatever. But once you get into these programs, everyone does kind of fine. There's some causal inference issues called conditioning on a collider that are at work here too. But generally speaking, getting in is the hard part. And usually, everyone I read all these applications, 10% of them, you're like, I don't think you're ready for this. You would not do well. And I'm probably wrong, but that's about it. Everybody else, you're like, you'd be fine.
Yeah.
And it becomes luck. It becomes who you know. It becomes, oh, you happen to be interested in an area that this other faculty member is interested in, so it would be a good fit. It's not that you're superior in some magical way. But that's also not to say that you can't do things. And I want to hear your thoughts on this because you could imagine listening to this so far and being like, well, I guess everything's random. I won't even try.
I don't mean that
and
at
that's
all.
not the case either. Yeah.
No, in fact, I think it's like you have to take advantage. Like you have to put yourself, do the work so that well, here's what I say. It is random whether you win the lottery, but like you can't win the lottery unless you have bought a ticket, Right. And like this is where the lottery metaphor breaks down because you can't do enough work to have a better odds in the lottery. But maybe a better thing is like playing poker, right? Like a lot of the cards that you get dealt in poker are random, but you can do the work to be better at poker. And I think that for me, that's kind of how I view the entertainment industry these days, is that I'm doing all this work so that I have scripts that I've written that I'm proud of, so that I have collaborated with people who I've built a reputation for. I'm out doing things so that the chances of someone seeing me are up. And then something else that I always tell people, that my real advice for, again, comedians is don't just do things that are sand paintings. And by that, I mean, a lot of people do stuff where it's if you weren't in the room on this one night in this one city, then it disappears. And that's fine. You should do some stuff like that. But I think what you really want, one of the best pieces of advice I got when I was just starting You're the Expert is from one of the producers of Wait, Don't Tell Me, and who had also worked on Car Talk. And what he said is he was came to him with all these business and marketing plans. It was thank you so much for meeting with me. What do you think about blank and here's my 4-year plan. And he was put all that stuff away. I mean, he wasn't dismissive. He was very helpful, but he was here's the only thing that matters. If you can make something that is good enough that a stranger tells another stranger about it, your show will be successful. And if you can't make something that is good enough that someone who doesn't know you will recommend it, then it won't be successful. So all you need to focus on is making something that's good enough like that.
So that a stranger would tell another stranger. So
someone who doesn't know you tells another person who doesn't know you.
It's not your mother telling a neighbor or whatever.
Exactly. Right. And oh boy, my mom will tell a neighbor. She will tell people on the plane. I will guarantee you that. I met your mom at our show. She came.
Oh yeah, that's true.
We have similar moms.
Yes. Yes. I think my mother is probably telling neighbors about you now. So
listen, I'll take all the moms I can get. My what's it called? My field team is largely people's moms that I've met. So
that's amazing. That's amazing. Also, it's very rare as adults living in major cities that aren't the cities that we grew up in, where anyone I know has met my mother. So thank you for reminding me of that. And it was 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. But so, that's one of the things where I think it takes some luck for something to take off. But once something takes off, I have put in place all these things where I have a newsletter they can sign up for that I have written a bunch of weeks. I have you can download the podcast. There's just ways for you to find me and engage with me in a way that is authentic to me. And that isn't just me trying to capture you, but is if you search for me, you'll be able to find me. And I think that sometimes people don't do that. And that's I think sometimes people don't do that because they're afraid of putting things out there because they think it's not going to be perfect and they want only one perfect thing out there. And what I always tell people is the way that you get better is by doing it over and over. So for me, one of the beautiful parts of doing a podcast or sending a newsletter is that like, I don't get to not do it because I don't think it's good enough. It's just like, well, it's Monday, it's got to come out. And then by the 100th Monday, wow, this is actually a lot better than the first Monday. And if I had waited, I would just have like one unfinished thing.
Yes. No, I'm so glad you said this. So one of our earlier guests in this season was Natalia Reagan, and we were just, you know her? She does the science comedy stuff. She's based in LA as well. She and I were talking about kind of getting over yourself. And you and I talked about this a little bit in the green room at the DC Improv together, which is like sort of the role that social media plays in fitting in all of this. And she and I talked about how, you know, we had this idea, and some of it might be generational, that, you know, I grew up, and when I was growing up, the thing that was success in terms of like performing and all of that was being on TV and having a network or a streaming. We didn't have streaming service, but once Netflix came along, it was like, I need to have a Netflix show. And sort of sneezing at the social media thing is like, well, if I have videos I'm posting online, like that's very silly. That's not actually the right way to go, but it's actually that newsletters, podcasts, like the regular ongoing things that someone could look up if they wanted to, versus I had never heard of it as, what did you call it? The sand painting?
Yeah, like a Tibetan sand painting.
Yeah,
you make it and then the monks make it and then it blows away in the wind.
Yeah, yeah. Or is a Chinese water calligraphy. I think it's the same thing. And there's a beauty to that, but the vast majority of my work tends to be that, or tended to be that. And then I would hope that someone from TV was in the audience, having also done nothing to get someone from TV in the audience, right? I'm just like, maybe they walked in and maybe it was a good show. And I wasn't really setting myself up to have a body of work for anyone to listen to. So we were talking about social media. It sounds like your areas, podcasting, newsletter, like why those as opposed to like Instagram in your life or whatever else?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, the answer is just like, they're ones that like feel authentic and that I actually enjoy.
Yeah, that's a good answer.
Yeah. I think that like sometimes even right now, like literally today, I was like, I feel I'm trying to decide whether it is good, healthy, like protective mechanisms that are like, you shouldn't spend more time on social media, or whether I'm like self-sabotage and fear of like, I'm not going to put all these jokes and stuff out on social media because I'm like self-sabotaging and want to protect. Because I sometimes have this that will happen mentally where I'm like, ooh, it's so fun to like imagine how great this script is going to be. And when I write it, everyone's going to love it. I'm going to get hired. I'm going to win an Academy Award. And as long as I never finish it, I'll never have to disprove that by reality. And so I sometimes wonder whether it's like self-sabotage to not actively engage with the others and whether I'm just trying to cling on to the idea of like, but I always could.
Right. I could have been
in general,
a contender
I try and push myself to do the thing, to just like put it out there and be like, you know, comedy is humiliating. Yeah. It is absolutely humiliating. It's the most humbling thing. No one has it go well all the time. And so as a result, you have to just like put yourself out there and be like, well, this could go well, or it could be really bad. And that is a part of the process too.
Yeah. And that's something to keep in mind too, because we talked earlier about, you know, stand-up versus improv. And stand-up, you have some semblance of control over how the show is going to go, in that you know what you're going to say and you know what reliable jokes are. But you're right. That could go. I did a show last night. It was terrible. Right. Yep. And you're just like, it's the same words, but I was off and it was off. And you know, you just don't know. But for some reason, for me anyway, stand-up was something that was very scary. And then once you bomb, it's not like it's trivial, but once you bomb enough, you're kind of like, I can handle it.
Yeah,
and as long as it doesn't happen every time, you are like, okay. But there's something about,
there's always something new that's hard.
What's that?
I said, there's always something new that's hard. I think that's the thing. Like, and when you first start out, the hardest part, in my opinion, when you first start out in stand-up comedy, the hardest part is bombing. Then over time, you're like, okay, that's just information. That just means I need to work on my premises and my punchlines, or something's not clear. Right. And then over time, then the hardest part starts to be, I'm at this open mic and this person who I started at open mics with is headlining a show right before me. And that show is sold out. And then you start to be like, okay, how do I deal with the competitive part? And then you talk to the people who you're competitive with and you're like, oh, they're not that happy either. Oh, they feel competitive. And you're like, okay, I get to this end point of like, we are all in that. And then a new hard part starts to be like, and now I've been doing this so long. Can I possibly do new things, or am I just going to fall back on? There's always something hard on in stand-up.
Yes. And probably in every, I mean, I'm sure in every discipline, but it's a very public way to struggle, I think, because it's like, it's not going well, or you're either headlining or you're at an open mic, and it's all very obvious to everybody where everybody stands in a way that, like, I don't want to trivialize it, but like if I give a lecture that's like not my best, in class, it's like, I'll do better next time. But it's not like everyone's like, wee.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, and also, I think this is so true for everyone, and it ties back into the social media, but like no one is paying attention or keeping score.
Yes.
It's like I worry so much about, like, I even, we've talked about this a few times, but like I worry so much about the label science comedian. And like, I so don't want people to be like science comedian Chris Duffy. Like, I want them to be like, he's a comedian. And also he does like this, like smart stuff sometimes, but also he does just like funny stuff sometimes. And like, I really don't want to be like, he's the science comedian. He only does science comedy. And yet no one else cares. They don't care. They're just like, wow, it's cool that you have like a show that is happening in any way. They're not like lame that you're not like the coolest of all the cool things,
Right. Well, I'm glad you said that, because I think I have that perception. And so I apologize. I'm sorry.
I get it. It's because most of the stuff I do is that. But
yeah.
But that's why I'm like,
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, it's just because that's why, I try and deliberately like make other stuff too. And then be like, please, like, I don't want to just be this thing, but I don't know. Maybe it's just who I am.
No, I think that's actually really important that you said that, because one of my, hunches when I'm working on this podcast and the idea of talking to people who do lots of different things is that, like, we all have these tendencies to put ourselves in boxes. We should really embrace living in between different boxes and creating our own space. And then I put you in a box because I was like, oh, science comedy, perfect. And that's not fair, but I'm doing what I'm criticizing the rest of the world for not criticizing. But I'm like, we can all contain multitudes.
Yes, of course. And, I think an interesting thing that I was just talking about with someone today, who I'm writing something with, is I think that in many, I don't want to overgeneralize, but I think that in many other fields outside of arts, people often get hired for potential. So like, they look at your resume and they're like, here's what we need. It seems like you could do that, and we'll put some training into you. And in entertainment, and certainly in television, you get hired for having done the exact thing that they're looking for, right? So like, you want to get hired to write on a show, you have to have written a script where they're like, we would have used this script, right? It's not potential. They're like, well, we would have used this exact script. So great.
You have to have done it.
And it's weird because, like, for me, I think even someone who's in the industry and has like written for TV before, like, it just seems obvious that like, if someone can write a really great half-hour comedy, I would be like, for sure, that person could also write a 1-hour drama. It's just a different kind of TV. But in the industry, it's like, well, do you have a script that shows that you've written a 60-minute drama? Because if you haven't done it, how could I possibly imagine that you could? And
not just any drama, but like the historical drama with like the lead character with a such and such psychological whatever, Yeah,
and I actually do like very much. I'm not trying to like dismiss that as a way of doing it. I get why people use that and how it's a helpful tool. And I think that what it just highlights for what we're talking about is like, you can change the course of your career, or you can change how you're perceived by just doing something else, right? Like, if you just are like, okay, well, I can't get paid to do it yet because I haven't already done it, I'll just do it.
Yep.
You even if you're like have a day job, I think people overestimate how good it is to quit your day job. It becomes not like, sometimes you can do better work when you still have a day job, but you could be like, I'm going to write my 60-minute drama, and then I have this amazing drama, and now people are like, once you get hired for that, then people are like, oh, he's the drama guy. He's no longer science comedy guy. He's no longer teaching guy. She's no longer a professor. She's the person who wrote for the serial killer show. Now she's serial killer person,
Right. And you use that until you're like, okay, now I've done that. And then I'm going to do this other thing and then be perceived. I think humans, we just can't contain that much more information about a single person in our brains. So we're just like, oh, your most recent thing. I'm like, he's the TED Talk guy. Okay.
Yeah. Well, you're the only one who knows you're the only one who knows, and certainly the only one who cares about all the like potential that you have.
Right. Well, that's one of the reasons when I start the show, I usually bring people on to say like, here's what I think you do. Like, you tell me, because what I perceive and what another person perceives of you are all likely to be a little bit different. But it's also the case that you do a lot of stuff that would for no reason be on my radar. And or looms larger in your life than an outsider might realize as well.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, what label do you put on yourself, or do you put a label on yourself?
That's a good question. I think I've landed on science educator of late, but that's only as of the last like 3 months, because I posted a bunch of TikTok videos and then I quit because I freaked out. And so now it's bothering me and I feel like I should go back. So there's the like, am I protecting myself or am I sabotaging? I think I'm sabotaging. But even that word feels boring. So it's more like science comedy kind of feels right. but I also do circus. So I don't know. I don't have a good word for it.
Yeah.
But I think I would like to be on TV talking about smart stuff, whatever that is.
I love that. I also think, like you can, a lot of times people, it seems like are so worried about like finding the through line as opposed to like realizing like the through line is that you all do that. That's the through line.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's still not the same thing as being able to show up in a room and say, actually, I do all these things. And they're just like, we don't know how to think about that. So
yeah, a way that I've been thinking about that, I forget where I heard this. This is not my thing. I'm stealing this from someone else, but someone was like, what you need to do especially in entertainment is give people a handle to pick you up with. Right. Ooh. So like, oh, he's the one-liner guy. He's like he does the science. He does science comedy. He does like, jokes about, he does political, like he's like the conservative political comedian. Yep. Okay. I'm not saying I like that person, but like that is like a handle where you're like, great, I get he can
slot in here and this is what it would look like.
Yeah. Because the way you get hired for anything here is people, and Sarah Schaefer said this once, and I think about this all the time. I don't know her, but I listened to her say this on a podcast, is like that the way you get hired for a job is in entertainment is your name is the answer to who would be good for this. Yeah. Do you know anyone who would be good for this? And then they say your name. So it's like, if you give them away where they're like, that's what happened with me. Do you know anyone who like does jokes about science that are like actually funny, but are still kind of like family friendly? And they're like, oh, he does a public radio show. That's exactly the definition of public radio show.
Right. No, something like that. And a label that I hadn't thought of for myself. I had drinks with a friend the other day, Kylie Holloway. I don't know if you know her. She's like in the caveat scene here in New York City. She was saying that she was talking to someone and she was in some writer's room and they were like, the manager guy was like, what we need is a funny data scientist.
Oh, yeah.
Does anyone know a funny data scientist? And I was like, that's me. Yeah. So I would happily take that label if someone wanted to. But also, funny data scientist,
but like, that's great. I mean, it's just like, and you can have multiple labels too, I think. It's just making it so that people know.
Right. And so that they're not confused once they look at the other thing, I mean, people look at your like social media, your newsletter, and you're like, what is even happening here?
And also you have to be good, right? Like when like we are people who recently met, and like I sent you an email after the show, genuinely being like, if I want to recommend you to places, because I do, what should I send them? And it's because like you were great. So then I was like, oh, well, of course, this is a person who I'll recommend. And I know that someone will be like, we need someone who does like data science in a funny way. And I'll be like, there's no one better.
Right.
You have to get it. But you have to be like good and then also like clear in that way.
This is we'll wrap this up in a moment, but I want to do something that I don't think I've ever done on this podcast and maybe never in my life, but quote Friends. All right.
Okay.
So in Friends, this is something I think about a fair amount. I don't know if you were a Friends fan. I was for a little bit and then I got sick of it. Whatever. We don't have to go there, but there was some episode where Monica was really bad at giving massages and she was really upset because she always wanted to be the best at everything. And they were like, no. You're the best, worst massage. And she was like, that's awesome. And so for me, I'm just like, well, I'm never going to be because I'll get defeatist and I'll be like, I'm never going to be the best comedian if I don't go all in on comedy. I'll never be the best scientist if I don't go on science. But I'm like, I can be the best science, comedy, circus performer in the world. And that I can do. Right. Because no one else does it. And that's the easy way. So I think about that ridiculous episode from a show that is not aging particularly well. And that has been how I've like carved it out or kept myself going.
That is so hilarious. Wait, can I tell a kind of unrelated story? I heard this from another TV writer. We were talking about how like sometimes this story might be apocryphal. I'm not sure, but I love it. It's about how like sometimes people like there was a time period where like, especially with Friends, where you could get into syndication and then everyone would just instantly go from like pretty rich to like extraordinarily rich, right? Like a TV writing has always been a lucrative paid job, but like when it got syndicated, then they were like, oh, the royalties from this, we're going to be set forever. And apparently someone told me that there was a period where like after that had happened, like everyone in the writer's room at Friends had like bought, cars and houses and they were all that. And then they were writing an episode where one of the plot points was that Ross, a paleontologist, archaeologist, he's one of those. I think he's a paleontologist.
Something like that. Yeah.
He had to lose an amount of money that would be significant, but not like dramatic. Like he had to lose an amount of money that he would care about, but that wouldn't derail the plot of the episode.
Okay.
And everyone in the room was so rich that the number they came up with was $5,000. And the executive one of the executives in charge had to be like, yeah, $5,000 is a lot of money. If someone lost $5,000, they would like that would be the focus of their day. And they were all
Right.
like, oh, okay, well, $5, $50, 500. What's a better number? You tell us.
Yeah.
I just like love that there was a moment where they were like, we've lost all touch with reality.
Yeah. Isn't there some, it's like Arrested Development or something where they're like, what is a banana?
What could a banana
$12?
cost?
Yeah.
$20?
Yeah.
Lucille Bluth, perfect.
That's what it was. Yes. R.I.P. That's amazing. And I remember reading about it. It's like they all got fancy cars at the same time. You're like, okay. So
that's a wild thing.
What's next for Chris Duffy? What are you excited about? And if you don't mind sharing, what are you like, what's weighing on you? What are you kind of uncertain or like worried about as you look ahead for yourself?
Well, I mean, I think we've already talked about like the things that are weighing on me, right? I think I'm always trying to figure out like, okay, so like who exactly am I? Who do I want to be creatively? And so I'm trying to like write projects that are not just continuing the things that have gone well, but that are putting me into a place that I want to be. So I'm trying to write like, scripted shows that have nothing to do with science and that are just like me trying to express some other things that I have in my head. So that's kind of one thing that I'm like struggling with and trying to figure out. And also the thing that I'm excited about. I think I have like, I have written some really great stuff that I'm looking forward to putting out there and to pitching. And, I think over the past couple of years, I have gotten as close as you can get to a thing happening and then have it not happening in TV, which is very common. And I'm like very excited for there to be a time where the coin flips and it comes heads up instead of heads down.
Right.
And then the other thing is, I really do love making the podcast. It's been such a great experience. It's been really cool to see it connect with people in a way that a lot of my other work I've been proud of, but hasn't connected with as many people. So I'm excited that season 2 is coming out now, is already out, and that we're going to be making a season 3, I think. So yeah, that's stuff that's going on and that I'm excited about.
Very cool. And I guess one final question, if you've got the time, is what is it kind of going back? I found myself thinking about that story you told of being on the bus in Cambridge and being like, all these MIT, Harvard people are doing this stuff that no one knows about. And to this day, that's been a thread of the kind of public facing, I guess, work that you've been doing is like serious issues, told to you by someone who can make you laugh and help you digest it. What is it about that draws you as opposed to like pure comedy or pure comedy? We were talking in the green room about like what counts as pure comedy, which is probably problematic language, but like, why not just be like, we're going sitcoms? Like why Wyatt Cenac show is so heavy? Like what keeps drawing you back to that side of things?
Yeah, well, I mean, I genuinely think that, and it's not that it couldn't be a sitcom, but I really do think that the thing that draws me and the thing that I care about ultimately is, and this is something that I do feel comfortable being like labeled as, rather than, I know I've said like, science comedy, but I think the thing that ties all these things together and that I care about is comedy as a means rather than as an ends, right? So like, I when I'm bringing people in because they're laughing and then I get to like slide something else in there. George Carlin talked about like when people laugh, their defenses go down, you can plant the seed of a new idea. And I think I really buy into the idea that like whatever the comedy is, if you're using it as a means and you're trying to get to something bigger, that is so incredible to me. And it's not that I respect people who do it as the comedy as an ends, where it's just a one-liner, just trying to make you laugh and it's not trying to make you think. I actually, some of my favorite stuff to do is to like unwind with that. But for me, it is always like, whether it's a show like The Good Place, right? Which is like, we're going to use comedy to get to talk about moral philosophy, whether it is, the podcast that I've done where like we get you laughing and then all of a sudden, hey, you learned it. You had a lecture about like structural engineering that you never would have listened to.
Yeah.
That stuff tends to be the thing that I think I'm most drawn to doing. And also that I'm kind of the best at, like that. I'm better at that.
Yeah. Well, I think I'll close by just thanking you, because I have been thinking about it since we first met a few weeks ago. And I'm reasonably sure that your voice was the backdrop of a lot of my commuting when I was in grad school and a postdoc, driving around and listening to NPR. And I'm sure that You're the Expert was, it was actually, I used to drive to go do circus. So it was like these 2-hour long drives in Michigan. And I would like listen to the Sunday programming, and I'm reasonably sure it was your voice. So thank you.
Oh, wow. That's so nice.
Yes. So where can folks find you, sign up for your newsletter, see you perform? And we'll put it all the links in the show notes as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost all, I think it's all on my website, chrisduffycomedy.com. Or chrisduffy.substack.com is the newsletter, but that's also on my website, Chris Duffy Comedy.
ChrisDuffyComedy.com. That's where we'll go. All right, Chris, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a real pleasure.
Yes, and hopefully we'll see you in person in one of these wild cities or locales.
Yes, I'm excited for
Again.
it. Thanks for having me.
And we'll bring our mothers.
Yes, can't wait to have our moms meet. They're really going to hit it off.
Yeah. And that's our show. Thank you so much for joining us for season 2 of Majoring in Everything. We're very excited to bring you all the amazing guests we've got for you this season. Don't forget to keep majoring in everything yourself. And Eric, did I do it? Is this a good second outro? See you next time.